Hey everybody, I was asked a while back to do some videos that sort of focused on the story collections, ranking the collections themselves against each other. And so what I decided to do, because it had been a while since I had made a concerted effort to read from start to finish the older collections, is that I would go back and I would pick those up and I would read them again and I would take notes about each story and I would rate each story as I went. So I started with the most recent, You Like It Darker, and then I decided to go all the way back to the beginning and reread Night Shift. This is my Night Shift collection. I have 4 copies of the original Signet paperback with the blue cover. I don't remember seeing many of these when I was a kid and browsing Stephen King. They mostly just had the black cover that has this image as the front cover with Night Shift Stephen King printed there. Once I realized that there was an earlier variant of the cover, this original one, I kind of became obsessed. And now every time I find one of these in the wild, obviously, regardless of condition, I have a tendency to pick it up. So as others have said, others have commented that I've read, it's really hard to find one of these with all of the proper points in good shape. So this is the best quality one overall that I have, and the eyes are misaligned. This is the worst quality one that I have, and the eyes are pretty much perfect on this one. So I don't know, maybe someday. Oh my gosh, this is a little ridiculous. I didn't remember about this. And here's a copy that's pretty beat up that is missing the eyes altogether. Why do I still have this? I don't know. I am a bit of a Signet Stephen King paperback obsessive, apparently. But anyway, that's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to be talking about Night Shift. I'm going to start at the beginning, work my way through all 20 stories, and rate them all. And when I'm done, assign a final overall score. And as I go through the collections, I will rate each story in each collection, assigning overall scores. And then at the end of that entire process, I'll be able to go back to the overall picture and rank the collections based on their overall scores that they were assigned during my reread. If that sounds really, really nerdy, that's because it is. But I hope that's part of the reason that you're here and that you're on that same wavelength with me. So without further ado, Night Shift. So several months ago, my friend Noah did videos for all of the first appearances of the stories from Night Shift. And I think that particular video is really interesting for the fact that there's 20 stories in Night Shift, and half of them, fully 10 of them, were published before the publication of Carrie. So before Stephen King was Stephen King, he was publishing stories that later appeared in Night Shift. They were written for a very specific purpose, and that was to sell, to make a quick and powerful impression, and to be sold to Cavalier magazine, pretty much, was seemingly his #1 patron in those early years, but to be sold to Cavalier to make some much needed cash. And Stephen King has said in multiple interviews that cash almost always seemed to come magically right when the family needed it most. So just when they needed to get an antibiotic for one of the kids' ear infections, a check would come in the mail. Or when they need to do a repair on their car, a check would come in the mail. Another story had sold. So in some ways, these stories are like the primordial ooze from which everything that came after sprouted from. And they're very visceral in general. They're very gritty. They're very immediate, because they needed to be to grab people's attention and get sold and get published in these magazines. So like I said, 10 of the 20 stories were published in Cavalier prior to the publication of Carrie. 6 of them were published after Carrie. So Stephen King was a published author writing novels, but was still writing stories and still selling stories. These stories to me are a little bit more luxuriant, perhaps, a little bit more character-based, while still being economical in scope. None of the stories in the collection are more than, say, 40 pages long. They're all pretty brief. They get in, they get out. And then 4 of the 20 stories, the final 4, were previously unpublished and were published for the first time in Night Shift. And to me, those stories, which would have been written in the mid to late 70s, after Stephen King was well established as a published author, are some of the highlights of the entire collection. So right out of the gate, we start with one of the previously unpublished stories, Jerusalem's Lot. So it is one of 2 Salem's Lot related stories in the collection. Jerusalem's Lot kind of reminded me of the infamous lost, considered lost prelude to The Shining before the play. It sets a very, very creepy stage, 100 plus years before the events of Salem's Lot. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. So it's like officially the Salem's prequel in a short story form. It is very Lovecraftian in time, in setting, and in language. It reminded me very, very much of Lovecraft, and that's a good thing. I thoroughly enjoyed that. It's very atmospheric. It's very scary, and it has a very, very interesting format. It is written in the form of basically one side of a conversation that is had via letter. So as you're reading these letters in this sort of experimental story format, the picture is becoming clearer and clearer that something is very, very wrong in Jerusalem's Lot. So it kicks the collection off with a bang. I really liked it, and I rate Jerusalem's Lot 9 out of 10. The second story is Graveyard Shift, and it was originally published in the October 1970 issue of Cavalier. It is one of the first Stephen King stories that I ever remember reading. I was a kid, and I was overwhelmed by the idea of reading a novel, but the short story collections were very appealing because the stories they're in were much shorter, much more direct. So before I ever actually tried to read the entire collection, I had read a handful of stories, including Graveyard Shift. So if Jerusalem's Lot reminded me of Lovecraft, Graveyard Shift reminded me of Poe. It's, in a way, kind of like a reverse Cask of Amontillado. So rather than walling something up, they are uncovering things and getting closer and closer to some horrifying truth that's sort of like at the heart of this just insanely dilapidated, creepy mill setting. It's very, very gruesome and very scary story. It does have some weak characterizations. I did listen to it in the audio, and I think maybe something about hearing the words spoken out loud instead of reading them on the page just really made them great even more. I mean, maybe back in the 60s when Stephen King was a young man, maybe people spoke like this, but I'm inclined to think probably not. So that the characters came across more like caricatures than actual flesh and blood characters, which I think is a negative against the story. Even so, it's very, very grisly, very fast-paced, and very entertaining, and I give Graveyard Shift 8 out of 10. The third piece in the collection is Night Surf, and it's from the spring 1969 issue of Ubris, the University of Maine literary magazine. It has a great first line, which goes as follows. After the guy was dead and the smell of his burning flesh was off the air, we all went back down to the beach. Like right out of the gate, bam, I gotta stop my car, because I was listening to it in the car. I gotta stop my car and write that down because that is a great first line. It relates to The Stand. Is it a prequel? Is it a sequel? I'm not exactly sure, but it takes place in the same universe as The Stand. One of the titles or subtitles that I was thinking of for this story would be Night Surf, A Captain Tripp's Tale. It's the first appearance of the concept of Captain Trips of the Superflu, which makes it an invaluable piece of the Stephen King universe because it's the origin story of Stephen King's perhaps most famous novel of all time. It's, I think, very dystopian, and it's scary in its matter-of-fact handling of the horrific elements of the story. The burning man from the first line of the story, it's all just handled very matter-of-factly because this is the reality that the characters are now living in, and I find that type of horror to be much more chilling and much scarier than more like intense and emotional, sort of spur of the moment horror. It has a muted effect because it isn't dwelled on overly much, and it just speaks to the reality of what these characters are going through. So, they burn a man alive and then, have dinner, hang out, watch the waves come in, because that's just the world that they're now living in, thanks to Captain Trips. I really enjoyed Night Surf. I really appreciate it as the origin of something much, much bigger and more famous, and I give it 8 out of 10. So next we have I Am the Doorway, which first appeared in the March 1971 issue of Cavalier. It is the story from which this famous image comes from. And what a creepy and disturbing image that is. I laughed when I was listening to it because he uses the word mellowly in the story. And as I'd listened to so much Stephen King, like back to back, certain things really start to reveal themselves to me. And in the 70s and 80s, the word mellowly appears over and over. It's one of Stephen King's pet words that maybe he didn't even realize he was using, but it certainly pops out, and mellowly shows up in I Am the Doorway, which is neither here nor there, apropos of nothing, but it did make me laugh and I wanted to mention it. I also found it to be sort of Lovecraftian in tone, and also kind of uniquely, especially for this collection in particular, it has a unique focus on body horror. So the hand with the eyes, the main character becomes potentially exposed to some type of alien, extraterrestrial something, and he wakes up to these like boils and sores on his hands, and then they become more pronounced, and then they burst, they break open, and then there are these eyes. So he's got eyes on his hands, and listening to the process of the eyes sort of sprouting and waking up, oh, it just got me itchy all over. I mean, I felt a lot of things in Night Shift, a lot of horror, a lot of revulsion at certain images and certain concepts, but I Am the Doorway is the only one that made me like itchy and twitchy with that body horror, and it's making me itchy and twitchy even now just thinking of it. And it's got one heck of a twist at the end, like most of the stories do, so that's hopefully not giving too much away. Most of the stories, they start with a bang, then they build their world, and then they pop you one, like the hand popping up out of the ground at the end of Carrie, to leave you with one final like jolting image. And I Am the Doorway has a heck of a final image. I really liked it, and I gave it 9 out of 10. So next up is The Mangler, which first appeared in the December 1972 issue of Cavalier. It's one of the It's one of the first of, there's sort of a sub theme in Night Shift, and that is machinery run amok, machinery gone awry. And in this case, it's about an evil machine in a commercial laundry facility. Stephen King's mother had worked in such a place, so there is a bit of sort of autobiographical connection to his own life. So he would have had experience with, I believe he worked in such a place as well. So he would have known how these things work firsthand. And there's some kind of hoo-ha about virgin blood sacrifice that brought the machine to life. And the whole thing, I mean, eventually at the end, it comes to life, and it starts walking out of the laundry and walking down the street with all the clang and clatter that you can imagine would come with that. The whole thing is incredibly ridiculous, and it's over the top kind of campy, but deliciously so. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was very, very entertaining, if a bit on the outrageously ridiculous and kind of stupid. I'm gonna say what it's like, a stupid, weird, dumb idea, but it's done very, very entertainingly so. So I give the Mangler 8 out of 10. Next up is The Boogeyman, which came from the March 1973 issue of Cavalier. I thought The Boogeyman had a really interesting build-up and an incredibly lame payoff. I thought I knew where it was going, and if it had gone where I thought it was going, I think I would have respected it a lot more. It would have been much more kind of chilling, but it has just this weird fizzle out kind of lame payoff, and kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. So for that reason, I give The Boogeyman 6 out of 10. Still entertaining, still decently written. It just kind of left me flat with that ending. Next up is Gray Matter, which was first published in the October 1973 issue of Cavalier. So time after time after time, he's getting these stories published in Cavalier, which looms huge in the Stephen King legend, Cavalier magazine, which is basically I don't know, kind of a, I think, slightly raunchier cousin to Playboy at the time. I highly recommend you check out Noah's first appearances video to see where all of these stories got their first publication. But anyway, Gray Matter, finally, so we're 7 stories in, and there's a story with a classic Stephen King main setting with some sort of good old boy type of characters who are talking and interacting with each other, which made me feel, it felt very much like in familiar Stephen King territory. The main characters and the way they interact, and then also kind of the body horror aspect, the sort of gruesome, flatulent, kind of icky horror in the story reminded me of Dreamcatcher. So I don't know that the two are not directly explicitly connected, but I would say that Gray Matter is like the spiritual ancestor of Dreamcatcher. It was very gruesome, very scary, very disturbing, and in classic Stephen King style. Very, very entertaining story, and I gave it 9 out of 10. So up next we have Battleground, and Battleground was first published in the September 1972 issue of Cavalier. It's a hilarious concept. So the best way I can describe it is like Toy Story on acid set in hell. It has several laugh out loud moments. Like, for instance, when the main character is at risk of losing his life from an assault of demonic, possessed little green army men, one of them, or a group of them, pull out a rocket launcher, and the guy notices this, and he says, "Rocket launcher? Damn it, that wasn't even on the box." And the story is just full of moments like that are laugh out loud hilarious. It has a funny twist ending. I found it very, very enjoyable overall. It's an incredibly silly concept, but it is handled with, like everything else, it's handled with a lot of verve and gusto and passion, and it's very, very entertaining, even if it is pretty goofy. So I give Battleground 8 out of 10. Next up is Trucks, which was originally published in the June 1973 issue of Cavalier. Trucks is very gruesome. It's also incredibly goofy and silly. It didn't really land with me. I know that it was the inspiration for the movie Maximum Overdrive, which was directed by Stephen King. So perhaps he must have more affection for the story, for having chosen it to be his directorial debut, but I just thought that it was pretty silly and it didn't really land. And if the Mangler is about evil laundry machines, then Trucks is about evil vehicles of any stripe, and the whole thing is just pretty silly. Entertaining, but silly. I give Trucks 6 out of 10. The next piece in the collection is Sometimes They Come Back, which was published in the March 1974 issue of Cavalier. So right before the publication of Carrie. It's one of the last stories that was published before the publication of Carrie. And I found Sometimes They Come Back, it's scary. It has a very welcome emotional resonance. Most of the stories up to this point have been scary and gruesome, but the characters are not well fleshed out enough for you to actually really care about them. Sometimes They Come Back has some added emotional heft, which I really appreciated. It actually felt to me like it should be longer, like maybe Stephen King intended for it to be longer, but then just kind of pared it back to get it done so he could get it out and get it sold and get it published. There was, I thought, some dropped threads. Like at one point there was a surviving member of the original gang and they were going to track this guy down and talk to him, and I don't think that happened. So it was going to happen and then it didn't, and I felt like the ending was very rushed as well. So the classic thing that you say about books and movies is that, well, the book's always better than the movie. But in this case, in the case of Sometimes They Come Back, I actually feel like the movie was sort of probably a lesser known adaptation from the 80s that stars Tim Matheson of Sometimes They Come Back, which I felt like is an exceptional movie. I first watched it when it was on TV when I was a kid, and I've seen it several times since. And it's great, and I feel like in this case, the movie was better than the book or the story. So if you haven't ever watched the movie of Sometimes They Come Back, I highly recommend it, and then read the story as well, and so you can compare and contrast the two. But Sometimes They Come Back, the movie, I thoroughly enjoyed. I would give a very high score if I were rating it. The story, I give 7 out of 10. Next up, we have Strawberry Spring, which was published in the fall 1968 issue of Ubris, the University of Maine literary magazine. I very much enjoyed the realistic setting. It made me think very much of like Arthur Conan Doyle with the fog everywhere. Just everything is just covered in fog, and there's nefarious doings, potentially like just mere feet away, that you can't see because of all the fog. It was written while Stephen King was in college and published while he was in college, and I can't, because of the setting and because of what happens, I can't help but think like maybe his classmates read it and were like, oh, I don't really know about that guy so much anymore. But regardless, it is a very strong story. It does, I think, kind of fall apart at the end. There's yet another twist ending, and I felt like the ending was predictable, incredibly predictable, and ended the whole thing on kind of an off note. But I'm not going to trash the whole story because of that, because leading up to that is thoroughly enjoyable, scary, gripping, and mysterious. So I give Strawberry Spring 8 out of 10. Next up is The Ledge. And The Ledge was published in the July 1976 issue of Penthouse magazine. So again, there's a realistic setting with this one. It's welcome. It has a lethally simple premise, like no supernatural anything, just a lethally simple premise and masterful suspense. The suspense is just it kicks in almost from the get-go and it carries through to the very end, and there's just really not much to fault with this one. I think it's a masterful, just tight little story built around a really, really sinister and simple idea. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I give The Ledge 9 out of 10. Next up is The Lawnmower Man, and that one was published in the May 1975 issue of Cavalier. I'm pretty sure The Lawnmower Man is the earliest Stephen King anything I ever read from start to finish when I was a kid. I remember aspects of it. I think it sticks in my memory because of the way the Lawnmower Man takes off his clothes and does his lawn care stuff in the guy's yard in the nude, and that must have just really stuck out to me as being sort of scandalous and controversial. So that lingers in my memory. It's gruesome, not to say that it's not, but it is also incredibly goofy. There's a handful of stories in Night Shift that are effective and entertaining, but just pretty dang silly, and The Lawnmower Man is one of those. It's another of the machinery run amok stories, and the Lawnmower Man is controlling the lawnmower, or the lawnmower is controlling the Lawnmower Man, but regardless, the lawnmower is like its own beastly, devilish entity and runs amok. It's a silly concept overall, but it was entertaining, and it did bring back a lot of memories from me as a kid. And it was still scandalous and controversial when the fat guy takes off his clothes and he's like naked with his butt up in the air eating the grass clippings, and it's like running down his belly and his chest, all the green slobber, and then of course, then what is it, a woodchuck or something, that the lawnmower goes out of its way to just grind up this woodchuck, and the Lawnmower Man just follows right along. Classic moment. It made me laugh when I listened to it this time. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not great. It's not classic, but it is fun. So I gave it 7 out of 10. So next up is another one of the previously unpublished stories, and that is Quitters, Inc. It is another very realistic. I don't recall any sort of supernatural element to it. It's just a brilliant concept. It's realistic. The suspense and the horror comes from unique places in the collection compared to other stories. It comes from sort of a unique angle, and it is like The Ledge. It is brilliantly built up, drawn out, and maintained. It truly has a brilliant execution and is one of the standout pieces of the collection. And I was thinking about the distinction maybe between a 9 and a 10, and what I would give a 9 and what I would give a 10. And I think what pushes the best stories truly to the top for me is if there's an added emotional resonance. If there's some aspect of it that makes me care about the characters. So The Ledge, I gave 9 out of 10 because it's brilliant and it's masterful, but the characters are still sort of stereotypes, and I didn't care very much for them. In the moment, I was very invested in what was happening, and I felt for the guy who, walking around the building on the ledge, but I didn't really care. And Quitters, Inc. has that added little something that makes me care about the characters. So for that purpose, I give Quitters, Inc. a perfect 10 out of 10. It is truly one of the highlights of the entire collection. As is the next piece, I Know What You Need, which was published in the September 1976 issue of Cosmopolitan. There is a bit of a supernatural element to this one, but I thought it had some really interesting things to say about romantic obsession, It has a really interesting angle that talks about love and free will, and how those two things interact, and if it really matters if one is dependent on the other or not. I thought the supernatural twist was welcome and unobtrusive. It was pretty low key. It actually added a lot to the emotional resonance of the story. Almost all of the stories in the collection have some kind of twist at the end. There was the surprise. I'm not going to call it a twist necessarily, but the surprise in I Know What You Need, like, truly shocked and shook me up, and I did not see it coming. And for that reason alone, I highly respect this story. It's very well written, very character driven, and like I was saying, it has that added emotional impact that truly pushes it over the top. So I also give I Know What You Need 10 out of 10. So next up is one of the most famous, at least by title, recognizable stories in the collection, and that is Children of the Corn, which was first published in the March 1977 issue of Penthouse. So, like sometimes they come back, Children of the Corn has a movie, and I had seen the movie pretty early on. So one of the big things that stuck out to me when I was listening to the story was that it felt like it needed to be longer. There were things that were getting glossed over, things that were getting left out, things that were getting kind of rushed. And so I don't know if that's a fault of the story or that my mind has just been sort of cross-contaminated with the movie, but it did feel rushed to me. It doesn't help the story that the main characters are thoroughly unlikable. Bert, the main male character, is a total moron asshole. Or, I could coin a new word, a morehole. Bert is a morehole. And the story suffers in building suspense because you actually want the main characters to get hurt. So you're kind of like, get on with it already. Smash these people's heads in, blow their brains out, end this misery, because these are some awful people. Another thing that kind of jangles the nerves with Children of the Corn is that it's the one story in the collection where I felt like the characters made really, really stupid horror movie choices. It's the only time that really happens in the collection, and it really kind of stands out. Against obvious better judgment, Bert insists on going into this town where everything is obviously wrong, and refuses to leave. Like, he just keeps going deeper and deeper, and it's like watching a horror movie where you're going, don't go in the basement, don't ever go in the basement, the power went out, why would you go in the basement? You know you're gonna get killed if you go in the basement, but he does it anyway. So that's what I'm talking about, stupid horror movie choices which make a couple of unlikable characters even more unlikable, in my opinion. There's one of Stephen King's sort of go-to tropes that is usually, I think, kind of a crutch, is that he'll have an explanation scene where nobody knows quite what's going on, and then all of a sudden someone has all the answers and they explain the whole thing. Well, I felt like in Children of the Corn, the explanation scene was a real stretch. It was kind of a huge leap. So Bert is like reading over a ledger of names and of the people that have lived and died in the town. And as he's reading it over, he's kind of making these inferences, these jumps in logic, which, while true, are highly unrealistic. So I felt like the explanation scene was another kind of negative against the story. All that to say, it is entertaining. It does move along at a very brisk pace. It's a great idea, which was, I think, fleshed out even further to good effect in the campy cults horror movie from the 80s of the story. But I give Children of the Corn, maybe charitably, a 7 out of 10. Next up is The Last Rung on the Ladder, which was another one of the previously unpublished stories from the collection. Right out of the gate, I got a kick out of the reference to Hemmingford Home, which of course is the home of Mother Abigail from The Stand. It's just one of the countless little threads that runs throughout and connects various pieces of the Stephen King universe. The Last Rung on the Ladder reminded me, I'm sure because of the barn and the hayloft and all of that, of the Other by Thomas Tryon, which is another, it's a classic that I thoroughly enjoyed. The Last Rung on the Ladder, I think, to me, of all the stories, packs the greatest emotional punch, and it just kind of works its way in and insinuates, like, little by little you start to understand and you start to see where the story is going, and it sort of masterfully blends the past with the present, and then in the end, how it all comes together, how it all ties together in the end is just emotionally devastating. And I thoroughly appreciate and highly recommend The Last Rung on the Ladder. I give it another 10 out of 10 for this collection. Next up is The Man Who Loved Flowers, which was published in the August 1977 issue of Gallery magazine. I thought this one had nice foreshadowing throughout. So the main character is a young man in love, seemingly, and in the background there's radio reports, and they're talking about this string of murders and crimes that are unsolved that are going on in the city. And at the end, I could appreciate, oh, well, that was some really good foreshadowing of what was going on in the story, although I didn't realize it at the time. It does have it ends on a really nice note, a bit of a twist about young love, which I really liked. I think The Man Who Loved Flowers has, hands down, the most entertaining passage in the whole collection, which I loved so much, I had to write it all down, and I'm going to read it to you now. And as he swung the hammer, the spill of flowers fell out of his hand. The spill spilled and broke open, spilling red, white, and yellow tea roses beside the dented trash cans where cats made alien love in the dark, screaming in love, screaming. So not only does it get a huge gold star for the specific phrase, beside the dented trash cans where cats made alien love in the dark, it also gets bonus points. So the first sentence has the word spill. The second sentence also has three variations of the word spill in one sentence, which I absolutely love. The spill spilled and broke open, spilling tea roses. It really makes me laugh. So The Man Who Loved Flowers is maybe one of the less brilliantly written stories in the collection, although it is highly entertaining and enjoyable, and I give it 7 out of 10. Next up is One for the Road, which was first published in the March-April 1977 issue of Maine magazine. It's the second story in the collection that has a Salem's Lot connection. So whereas Jerusalem's Lot would be squarely a prequel, One for the Road would be very obviously a sequel story. It's a very welcome afterword to Salem's Lot. So the ending of the novel is somewhat ambiguous. Mark and Ben are on the hill overlooking the town, and they start a fire, and that's pretty much it. But One for the Road clarifies just exactly the state of vampirism in Maine, and it might not be what you would have hoped for. It's very creepy, very atmospheric, so I think with Salem's Lot, Stephen King reinvented the vampire novel and made it, brought it into modern times. And then One for the Road I think builds even further on that vampire renaissance, which he started with Salem's Lot just a couple of years before, and has some really, really creepy and chilling moments. Chilling, like from the emotional sense, not just because it's snowing and very, very cold in the story, but highly recommend this story. It's a lot of fun and welcome addition to the Salem's Lot universe specifically. I give it 9 out of 10. And then we finish with story number 20, another previously unpublished story called The Woman in the Room, which is about cancer and seems to be inspired by Stephen King's own experience with his own mother, who also had died of cancer just a few years before Night Shift was published. So she lived long enough to know that Carrie was going to be published, but she died before it was actually published, to see like all of the amazing things that came to Stephen King's life after Carrie was published, and all the things he could have done for her and would have wanted to do for her that he never got to do. I think a lot of that emotion, Stephen King talked about the Bachman novel Roadwork as being maybe his attempt to come to terms with that, the death of his mother with cancer and stuff. I kind of despise Roadwork. I think The Woman in the Room handles the same subject, the same topic, much more head on and much more successfully. There's no supernatural element at all. It's an incredibly personal concept, very scary, very poignant, and very, very realistic. It's very matter of fact. It's terrifying, it's horrifying, because we all might end up in a similar situation. And so it's one of the stories, maybe the only story in the whole collection, where you actually find yourself wondering, what would I do? What would I do in the same situation? Which I thoroughly enjoyed. It's very emotionally gripping. I really enjoyed the fact that, so kind of the climax of the whole story, the mother understood what her son was trying to do, and she was in on it, and she basically gave him permission to proceed. And he's telling himself, like, if she does this, if she does that, I'm just going to forget about the whole thing. I'm just going to walk away, and you know, I won't move ahead with this. But she does give him permission. So she absolves him of that guilt, although he's going to feel guilty probably for the rest of his life. Just an impossible type of situation, but there's also sort of a poignant beauty to it as well. I thought it was just an exceptional story and a really, really strong way to end the collection. A collection of so much just like bizarre, almost ridiculous, like supernatural, haunted this and demonic that stories. The Woman in the Room is just very, very real, very powerful, and very emotional. And I give it also 10 out of 10. So out of the 20 stories in the collection, I have 10 what I would consider to be stone cold classics, 10 perfect 10s. And that's Quitters Incorporated, Quitters Inc., I Know What You Need, The Last Rung on the Ladder, and The Woman in the Room. Would you agree with that assessment? Do you have other favorite stories? Do those 4 stories rank much lower in your esteem? I want to know what you have to say. What do you think about that? In summary, at the end, Night Shift is truly an indispensable collection. It's just a vital, vital piece of the Stephen King story, half of it taking place before he was even Stephen King. So the Bachman books were written in this same period, and then were published under the Bachman name. And so to me, and to a lot of people, that period before Carrie is really the Bachman period. And so half of the stories in Night Shift could have been considered Richard Bachman stories. And Richard Bachman, back in the day, was a much more desperate, pragmatic, no guarantee of success, sort of like the sword of Damocles just hanging over his head at all times. Didn't know if he was going to make it. And the writing is completely different from the much more calm and confident and assured writing of today, where Stephen King's fame and fortune is secured. And these were stories that were written while Stephen King was doing other jobs, menial jobs, like 9 to 5 or graveyard shift, no pun intended, jobs to help pay the real life bills that his real life family was experiencing, to deal with the situations that they were experiencing. So it just, the stories were written in from a completely different place, and come across just very, very vital and very alive and very visceral because of it. Night Shift was the first in a long line of collections, all of which I think have something to recommend them. But Night Shift, I think, just by virtue of what it represents, is the indispensable collection. If you only ever read one, I would at least read Night Shift to see sort of the building blocks of where Stephen King came from. So finally, I've been rating the stories as I've gone along. So there's 20 stories, 10 points apiece, for a possible score of 200. That would be the perfect score. Overall, I give Night Shift 165 points out of a possible 200 for a final score of 82.5. I realize now that I did not do that final rating with You Like It Darker, but I will pick that up in the eventual video that I do, where I compare and rate all of the collections. But Night Shift gets a very, very respectable 82.5. I think the lowest rated story in the whole collection was 6, and there were many, many that were 7s, 8s, 9s, and of course a handful of 10s. But like I said, let me know your thoughts on the ratings. What's your favorite Night Shift story? What's your least favorite? Do you think I got it right? Do you think I got it wrong? Do you also collect the blue Signet paperbacks? If you have ever find a lead on a really, really nice first printing that has the eyes lined up and all the bells and whistles, I was gonna say you should let me know, but seriously, you should jump on it, because I chased one down on eBay several years ago and ultimately was not the successful bidder. I bowed out when the bidding got over $100 for a paperback, and it was truly like it had just come off the rack. It was really remarkable. But these old books, people give paperbacks a hard time, like they're not collectible, they're not valuable. But of course they're collectible, because people love them and people have an emotional connection to them. But anyway, this whole video has been rambly. That was just one more ramble. And thank you very much for your time. Thanks for sticking with me through this video. Thank you for subscribing. I really, really appreciate your support, and I hope that wherever you are, you're having a good time, you're taking care of yourselves, you're staying cool this summer and staying safe, and I will talk to you later. Bye.